Okay, so I'm very honored to be invited to give this talk today. And the Old Growth Forest Network that I founded, I'll talk about a little bit today. And we're a national organization, but we're very well represented in Virginia, especially here tonight. My board president, Jeff Wright, is here. He lives in Virginia. And Robin Haynes, our board vice president, lives in Charlottesville. And Brian Kane, who is an alumnus of this university with his master's in architecture here and a master's in planning also, is now our Mid-Atlantic Regional Network Manager. So I myself live in Maryland, but that's not that far away. So we're kind of celebrating being here together tonight for this cause. So thank you for the invitation. So my talk is going to be a little bit unusual tonight. It's not going to be slides. I'm just going to talk, and I'm going to start by talking about playgrounds. You might think, where's this going? But I promise I am going to segue and get to the forests. And the talk is kind of two parts. The first part I call Dreams of a Better Land. And the second part is our public forests should not be public relations campaigns. So let's start with the playgrounds. Somehow I never learned this, but playgrounds weren't always around. The playground movement started in 1885 with a pile of sand dumped in Boston. And this was done because there was a pediatrician who saw this happening in Germany with these piles of sand for the children to play in. And when she was in the States, she said, well, we should do this here. And so that pile of sand got dumped in Boston, and it was very popular. And then 14 more loads of sand got dumped various places around Boston. And by 1900, there were a dozen or two other cities that had these playgrounds, these sand piles. And by 1917, it was 481 cities that had them. And today there are over 80,000 playgrounds in America. So this started as an idea. Somebody just took the initiative. And now we look at it as like, oh, yes, of course, playgrounds are a good idea. And we'll probably continue to have playgrounds. So there was a time when people had to lobby for them and raise money for them and convince other people that this was a good idea, but now they're here to stay. Another dream was the idea that perhaps there should be some land owned by all Americans. And this is the story, of course, of our national parks. And it's the same thing, a few people dreaming big and other people who knew a good idea when they heard it, and yes, some money willing to put toward it. So the version of how the national parks got their start really inspired me in starting the Old Growth Forest Network, because when they first had the idea for national parks, they had no idea that we would have so many of them today and so many millions of acres protected as national parks. So how that first park got started was there was a team that was sent to survey Yellowstone. Oh, there's this, wild part of our country, and we want you to go survey it and see what's out there. Well, after weeks on the trail exploring and surveying, one night this team was sitting around a fire and they were talking about what should be done to the area. And they saw these minerals that could be extracted, or they saw these places where they could build hotels or ways to make money from the park. And then one man, Cornelius Hedges, spoke up and he said, what about a place for the enjoyment of all people instead? So that was the germ. And that night, the rest of the team couldn't stop thinking about it. And the story goes that they were tossing and turning and thinking, yes, this is what should be done. This should be a place for all people to enjoy. So maybe the land was speaking to them too at that point. But luckily, they had an in with a politician who had just been elected to Congress, and very soon that bill got submitted, and calling for Yellowstone to be a national park. And by the following year, that bill had passed. And now there are 84 million acres in national parks. And I'm sure probably every one of us here in this room have been to a national park and enjoyed it. Started with a dream, an idea, a good idea. Sometimes it's called America's best idea. The next big American land dream came from a real estate developer. Someone who cut down forests to build casinos, tennis clubs, golf courses, that sort of thing. Abbot Kinney was his name. He was unusual for his time. He spoke 6 languages. He had traveled all over the world. But in 1891, he saw what was happening to our landscape, right? This was the worst of the cutting, just right at that curve from the late 1800s into the beginning of the 1900s. Had to have been a horrible time to be around if you loved nature and the forests, because that's when the clearing was at its peak. And not only were these forests cleared, but there were fires happening from the brush that was left behind. There was all sorts of erosion from the rainstorms that came, and the soil wasn't protected by the forests. And in many places out west, the places where the forest tried to come back, they were just continually burned so they could be kept as pasture and the forest wouldn't come back. And Cornelius, or Abbot Kinney, said that we needed these national forests that other countries had had so we could make sure that we always had forest land in America. And if some forests are under government control, they could be properly managed, and the nation would always have forests for harvesting and watershed protection. That took a little longer to get passed through Congress, a lot of work and lobbying for that bill, but it passed, and today there are 190 million acres of national forest land blanketing the country, and chances are pretty good that you've experienced national forest land as well, maybe camping or maybe fishing. But the preservationists, this is the next idea, looked around and said, these national parks that were so recently created were being kind of used and abused. Roads were being built through them. Hotels were being built in them. They were not really honored for the nature. There were more spots, tourism came first. And meanwhile, the national forests, this act to create the national forests, and the national forests were looked at mainly as just a source of timber. So here we have our parks that were set aside, that were being mishandled, we'll say, and then the national forests that were just looked at as sustainable wood fiber. And the preservationists said, we need something else. We need some wilderness. We need some places set aside from the human. So John Muir, heard of him? He'd been talking about this for a while and writing about it, using his words. But he wasn't as much of a doer as Aldo Leopold. So it was in the 1920s that Aldo Leopold then helped John Muir to promote this idea of the wilderness areas. And the first protections, this was a good idea that really took a long time to get off the ground. So Bob Marshall in the 1930s said, okay, I want to help with this. So some of you have heard of like the Bob Marshall wilderness areas out west. And he worked long and hard on it. And the administrators of both the national parks and the national forest raised objections and slowed the passage of it. I think they all had their, their little fiefdoms, their kingdoms, and they didn't want this other third piece to be in there. Decades passed working on this, and the influential champions of the Wilderness Act passed too, including Bob Marshall. The Wilderness Act was not enacted until 1964, right? So it took many decades, and it took 8 years since the time the bill was first introduced until it got passed. So as a little aside, in June of this year, the Old Growth Forest Network celebrated the 60th anniversary of the Wilderness Act by putting the first dedicated wilderness area, anybody know what that was? The Gila Wilderness in New Mexico, into the Old Growth Forest Network. So it was our 250th forest that we put in the network. I'm going to tell you more about the network later, but just we're talking about the wilderness. So we just had the 60-year anniversary. So it took them 40 years to get that passed, and now we've had them for 60 years. And we love our wilderness areas, right? Unfortunately, there's not many in the eastern parts of the U.S., but we all, even if we've not been to one of the wilderness areas, we all feel better knowing that they're there. There's 100 million acres in wilderness areas in the U.S. So it's difficult to imagine this country without playgrounds, without national parks, without national forests, without national wilderness areas. But we can't stop there, right? These were ideas. These made this land a better place. And that's not the end of it. We've got to keep going. Sometimes we get so caught up in entertainment, politics, or economics, whether it's personal or global, that we forget to dream big. We forget that dreaming big is what America is all about. In fact, the very idea of an independent America was just a big dream, right? It was in the minds of a few farmers, mechanics, and carpenters, ordinary workers and tradesmen, not politicians. These are ordinary people that got together and said, we need an independent nation. They started meeting in 1760 at the home of Thomas Dawes. And the independence Dawes and his friends dreamed about was not declared until 16 years after that first meeting. We all know that date, 1776. It took a war to secure that independence. The democracy they dreamed of was a participatory democracy. Note that all these dreams of a better land, from the dream for an independent nation to all the other things I talked about, were started not from the politicians. So these aren't people that get in power and then have the dreams. These are ordinary people that have the dreams and then convince the politicians that this has to happen. So these accomplishments have not reached an end. And our next thing is to participate in this democracy and secure forests for the next generation, that these forests will be a solace for their world, ever more filled with electronics and traffic. Save for us, the next generation is asking, please. A breath of fresh air, the colorful flash of a warbler's wing. We want a forest that we can connect to. We want a living world. Not only in some park or a wilderness that's hundreds of miles away, but what about a place right in my community, please? A place that I can get to after school, a place that I can go to with my grandparent or with my teacher. And this is our dream in the Old Growth Forest Network. A forest in each county of the United States, forever protected from logging and accessible to all. A woodland trail that will always be there, not one that will be cut down for the next mall or the next roadway. One nearby place where we can witness the natural condition of our homegrown. A forest that will be old growth in time, even if it is not now. So we're working hard to create this old growth forest network. About 2/3 of our counties can support forest growth. That's 2,400 counties. Right now, after a dozen years of work, we're over 10% of the way to our goal. The forest in New Mexico I mentioned was our 250th forest in the network. So these forests can be owned by any entity. Some of them are federal, some of them are in wilderness areas, some of them are land trust owned, community owned, camp owned, church owned. It could be even privately owned, but they have to be protected from cutting, and we help them do that if they're not already protected, and they have to be open to the public and accessible. So we've been busy this summer. You know, that was in June where we had our 250th. Now we're up to 267 forests in the network in 37 states. And thousands of people who have heard about the idea think it's a good one, and they signed up to be supporters. And you can see in that booklet that was handed out the forests that were added in 2023 and the people that have financially supported our work. And this would be a good time for the politicians to step up now too, right? After the ideas and maybe the 1%. And this can be the next dream. As Howard Zosner said, he was a forest wilderness advocate. As he was trying to pass the Wilderness Act, we are not fighting progress, we are making it. And as Theodore Roosevelt put it, if I fail, I will do so daring greatly. So our team, we're daring greatly, and so far we're convinced that America's ready for this next idea. And to make it even more challenging, we're not stopping at one in each county, because we believe that every community should have a forest like this, maybe one that people can ride their bicycle to or get to very easily. So we started the Community Forest Network to recognize communities that are forward-thinking enough to preserve a forest for the enjoyment of the citizens and habitat for all the creatures. So as we were talking about, when communities reach a certain size, they're expected to have a school, they're expected to have a playground, they're expected to have a fire department, but we don't always expect a community to have an accessible, protected forest. And we need to change that. That should be part of the infrastructure of every community. And this is not a novel thought, right? In 1859, Henry David Thoreau wrote, "Each town should have a park, or rather a primitive forest, of 500 or 1,000 acres, where a stick should never be cut for fuel, a common possession forever for instruction and recreation." So that was 165 years ago. Can you imagine if 500 acres was set aside here, Charlottesville, 165 years ago? That would be a very old forest now. It would be a jewel, a centerpiece of the community. In another place he wrote, "A township where one primitive forest waves above while another primitive forest rots below, such a town is fitted to raise not only corn and potatoes, but poets." Now, when I first read that many years ago, I didn't really understand this bit about the forest rotting below. But as I got deeper and deeper into ecology and studying old growth forests, I came to recognize what he was talking about. Because if you walk through an old growth forest, you are going to see a lot of big wood on the forest floor. This is called coarse woody debris, and it's very important for the ecology of an old forest, because that rotting timber on the forest floor is holding moisture. It's creating habitat for fungi, for mosses, for ground beetles that are eaten by salamanders and amphibians, and then the small mammals. And that large, coarse, woody debris is only going to get there on the forest floor if those trees lived there for hundreds of years, died naturally, and fell and were left alone. If you go to an industrial managed forest, you're never going to see big trees well rotted on the forest floor. So he's describing an old growth forest where there's trees waving above and big trees rotting below, because that's what the old growth forests do. He understood that. Let's see. Oh, so community forests. New England does have many town forests, but too often they fall victim to zealous foresters who convince the town selectmen that the forests need to be managed, right? This is what happened. You have a small, these town select boards that don't really have that much experience with forest ecology, and they don't know what to do with their town forest, so they call in the forester, and the forest tells them that the forest needs to be managed. And by the way, they'll get some extra income to balance their budget, so they all vote yes. And so this is what happens to a lot of the town forests. Towns have also built on or sold off their forest land. In Maryland, we had a progressive community that was designed Greenbelt. It was part of the New Deal. The Greenbelt was this belt of forest around the town. Well, little by little, the town started selling off the Greenbelt or letting things be built on it, until a group of citizens said, wait a minute, what's going on here? Our Greenbelt is disappearing. And they had to actually buy some of it back. So, okay. So how do we accomplish this vision of a forest nearby every community? From my experience across the country, what has been most successful is having a governmental committee in each town that takes on that task. It might be called something like the Open Space Committee. In my Maryland town, we have a Parks Committee. We have a Beautification Committee that plants street trees and flowers, but we have nothing like an Open Space Committee where they're trying to save the last bits of forest around our community. So what happens when those last bits of forest go up for sale, because we're not ready to jump in and say this is a forest that should be preserved? What happens instead? It gets sold and turns into like storage units, right? Or restaurants, or townhouses. But it doesn't have to be that way. I've seen other examples. For instance, in Lyme, Connecticut, a small town, population 2,500. In 1996, the town of Lyme, Connecticut voted to create an open space trust account, and they also voted to put aside a part-time salary for an open space coordinator. Really small part-time salary. So they hired this woman to be the open space coordinator. Now, this is important because if you just expect people to do this as a volunteer, it's going to be very difficult. People need to be able to support themselves. Their work needs to be respected. So it needs to be important. The town is going to pay their janitor. Why not pay the open space coordinator? So this woman took a part-time job doing this. She also worked part-time for the local land trust. So this is really important. So the Open Space Commission, which she was, and the Land Trust, which she was on, they could sit down, literally lay out maps of the town and say, where are the forests that are left around our town? And of these forests, which are the oldest, most intact forest? And of this one right here, it looks amazing. It's close to town. It's intact. Who owns that forest? What family is that? Oh, do you know them? Your son went to school with their daughter or something like that. Do you think you could talk to them and see what their future plans are for that forest? Could you talk to them and say if they ever thought to pass that forest along, that this would be a beautiful community forest? So this is how it gets done. And they identified a parcel like this and collaborated with other organizations. And there is money out there once you have a vision and you're collaborating and you put it down on paper. So this particular preserve was purchased for $1.4 million. 60% of the funding came from the state, right? And a large portion came from the Nature Conservancy. Meanwhile, towns without that level of foresight and cooperation received no state grants for land preservation. So it's like that little investment in just a part-time job of an open space coordinator brought all that money in. And that 250-acre preserve, by the way, has been protected with a no-log conservation easement. It is now part of the Old Growth Forest Network. It was forest number 139. And the family that owned that, the Johnstons, they can go there anytime they want because it's open to the public. So they can still enjoy their forests. So that's the type of visions we need. In addition to aligning the budget for open space coordinators, cities can also budget for land acquisition. For example, thanks to education and lobbying by the Indiana Forest Alliance, the city of Indianapolis, Indiana, is now allocating $1 million a year for the next 3 years for strategic land acquisition. A lot of people don't realize how much federal money is available right now for land preservation. In 2020, the Great American Outdoors Act was signed into law, authorizing $900 million annually in permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Over $300 million of that is for community land acquisition. The Great America Outdoors Act will provide $2.8 billion in the next fiscal year, 2025, for public lands projects. Grants for the projects are often based on organizations cooperating together. So there is money there right now, but it takes a lot of work to get people to cooperate and to actually write the applications for these projects. So if I were the god of land protection in my community, I would take the following steps. 1, get a salary written into the town's budget for an open space coordinator, like I said. 2, have the coordinator work with other local groups. And 3, have the open space coordinator attend the annual conservation finance boot camp given by the Conservation Finance Network. Have any of you heard of Conservation Finance Network? Yeah, they have a boot camp every year. So imagine the investment. You know, you're investing in this small part-time salary, pay this person works on this vision with other organizations, goes to the boot camp, gets the documents together because there are people there that can help you and submit them, and that might be all it takes to get your community a forest worth millions of dollars. So the vision and the work. The campus has such beautiful trees. What gorgeous weather we've had, right, the last 2 days. And the planting of trees is a good thing, but as the poet W.S. Merwin said, you can't plant a forest, only a forest makes a forest. Because a forest is not just a few trees. It's a huge ecosystem of many related things that we can't even begin to understand. So I love this movement of the Milwaukee Forest too, the plots. It's like, just get this thing going and it'll create itself. All right, that's the end of part 1. Thank you for your patience. Let's see how we're doing on time. We're doing okay. Part 2, our public forest should not be a public relations campaign. So I'm going to talk about what's happening now at the highest levels of government. A very important political debate is underway right now that will decide whether old growth forests will continue to exist on our federal lands, primarily those national forests I was talking about. These ancient forests that are still on the national forest land have survived for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. But until last year, our federal land managers had no idea how much original old growth forest was left in the national forest or where exactly it was located. And that's all changing right now. It began to change in April 2022, it was Earth Day, and President Biden came out with Executive Order 14072. And he said, I would like the Forest Service and the BLM to define old growth, tell me how much is left on federal land and where it's located and what the threats are to it. And you have 1 year. So, yeah, this was a huge task. I mean, and you'd think all this time the National Forest should have been monitoring these things and knowing where the old growth forest was, but they didn't. They had to scramble. And I was really doubting whether they would be able to do it. But sure enough, 1 year later, they did come out with a document that defined the old growth forest, and there's different definitions depending on the forest type and the area in the country that you are. So I think those definitions are pretty good. I think that's reasonable. And the amount of old growth was 18% of our national forests, which sounds like a lot. Everybody was surprised. But 14% of that is the pinyon pine juniper forests. So they're not commercially valuable, and that's the reason they haven't been cut, and that's why they're old. So out of the 18%, 14% were the pinyon pine juniper, and that leaves 4% of our national forest land is old growth. And of that 4%, half is already protected in wilderness and parks, and the other half is not protected at all. So the next question the administration asked after this was how best to protect the remaining old growth forests. You know, how do we protect this? They didn't want to even need to ask why. We know why. Right? We know why these forests are so important. What Tim said, that long list of what these older forests do better. And anyone that's ever hiked in one, of course, would say, yes, they should be preserved. They're very important. Their biodiversity benefits, their carbon benefits. So the first agency report describing protections needed for these forests emphasized insects, diseases, climate change, and wildfires. And those of us in forest protection community said, I think you're forgetting something there. How about the trees that you're cutting down? The old growth forest you're cutting down because it's still happening. And so the Old Growth Forest Network, we wrote letters and got other people to write letters and worked with other organizations that were also writing letters. And we all had the same voice and said, and cutting them down is a threat too. So they finally put that in their reports. Now, just before Christmas, so this year, December 2023, we were thrilled when the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is the agency the Forest Service is in, announced a proposal to amend all 128 national forest management plans to conserve and steward old growth conditions. We're like, whoa, this has never happened before that one proclamation would affect all our national forests at once. They're used to managing them piecemeal. national forest management plans. So we're just like, yay, doing the happy dance. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack said, old growth forests are a vital part of our ecosystems and a special cultural resource. This proposed nationwide forest plan amendment, the first in the agency's history, is an important step in conserving these national treasures. Yes, right? We're hearing the president talk about old growth forests. Never heard that before. We're the head of the agriculture secretary saying we need to protect old growth forests. But you can't just wave a magic wand like that, even if you're the Secretary of Agriculture, because before the proposed amendment could be finalized, there had to be an environmental impact statement. And the environmental impact statement had to be approved. So in early 2024 this year, more comments were accepted while the draft environmental impact statement was being prepared. And those comments were due in February, and we commented. And just before the end of the comment period in January, 200 scientists wrote and said we'd have to preserve not only the old growth, but the mature forests so we can have future old growth. And we think we're really got some momentum going. And the very next week, this is late January, early February this year, the Republican governors of Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Nevada, and Utah all wrote objecting to this change. They said management decisions about national forests should be made locally, not in Washington. Their letters state that the USDA and Forest Service should be removing administrative bottlenecks and working with partners to increase the pace and scale of forest management projects. So here's the highest levels of government, and they're really trying to do something right. And it's very interesting because you try to do something right, and then here's all the preservationists and academics saying, oh, we want even more. You're not doing enough. We want more. And then here's all these powerful governors of these Western states really angry and putting them down. So who knows which way the political winds are going to blow. But it's a critical moment. Now, when they finally came out with the draft environmental impact statement in May, we were really disappointed. It felt like the Forest Service had really kind of dumbed down the alternatives. You know, the way these environmental impact statements work, they give you alternatives. And they didn't even pick the strongest alternative that would prevent old growth forests from being cut and sold. And so then Old Growth Forest Network and the other forest groups we worked with, then we had to yet again comment and say this environmental impact statement is not good enough. We need something stronger. That comment period ended last week, and now we're just waiting to see what will happen next. But we need everybody's voice, right? There's not that much left. There's 4%. Well, really, yeah, only 2% that's not protected. And there's right now plans in the national forest to cut old growth forests. We need to do something. We'll see. The lesson to me, when I see people in this room, like, you all want the old growth forests protected, right? You talk to the school children, they want the forest protected. Most of the people want it. And it's just the lower levels of Forest Service that seem to be obstructionist. And why is that? And this is where I'm going to get edgy on you. It's going to be some eyebrows raised. Thank you. And squiggling. From what I have seen, the obstructions are mainly from the people that have gone to forestry school. And they're taught that timber is a commodity. And anything that's going to get in the way of that, they'll resist and put their heels down. And the irony is that these are the folks that have been to forestry school that are that are hired to manage our public lands. So somehow we've got to work our way out of that quagmire. We need to get maybe more ecologists in the position of power there, or we need to change what's being taught in our forestry school. We're at an interesting time now. And foresters know that cutting old growth forests with big trees just for profit to get the next crop is unpopular. So they're actually working with organizations that hire public relation firms to make it sound more palatable, the reasons that they're cutting. The most common reason you hear for cutting now is for the health of the forest. You know, they're never going to talk about money. We need this for the health of the forest. And that's exactly what made me want to write this book. I said, is it really healthy for the forest to cut it? Let's look at the scientific information from any scientist who compared an old unmanaged forest with a managed forest. Which one had more biodiversity, whether it's salamanders or fungi or mosses or lichens, and where are the oldest trees? Where are the largest trees? They're all in the unmanaged forests. These forests evolved hundreds of millions of years before there were even humans. You know, why do we think they need to be managed to be healthy by us? Maybe managed if you want the most income from them. I'll give it that, but not for the health of the forest. And now, you know, the other words you'll hear is it's sustainability, it's climate resiliency, it's restoration, it's improving wildlife habitat, it's fireproofing. I mean, that all sounds good. But then when you look at the results, it's disastrous. And it's confusing because there's the people standing up there in uniform saying this. We have to do this for the health of the forest. And the average citizen says, well, what do I know? I have to trust them. They're the experts. Well, those experts are the ones that are destroying our forests. So what's the answer? We could start by removing the profit motive entirely from our national forests. We could eliminate the quotas. We could eliminate the idea that a forest manager has done a good job if they can extract a lot of timber and not be sued by an environmental organization. Our national forests only supply 5% of our nation's wood products. And I think by carefully reclaiming and reusing, which we're not doing enough of now, we could probably do away with that 5%. Wouldn't it be beautiful if our national forests, maybe at least for 20 years, were not cut and could be a carbon bank and a place of biodiversity? You know, I'm in favor of that. Anybody else in favor of that? Removing the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, cleaning our streams and rivers. We can have it. These are our forests. We only need to want it badly enough, like we wanted national parks, like we wanted the elimination of slavery, like we wanted women to have votes. I hope we can stand together in wanting to keep the last of the old forests on planet Earth. And I feel the wave rising from our president to our youngest children. It's exciting to be part of it. And I know you're part of it. And together, let's not just dream of this better land. Let's create it together. Thank you.